coffee is a problem, and you may have seen this before. You might know the cycling guy who has spent more on bicycle components than his whole family spends on groceries in a month. Carbon everything, maybe he rides twice a month. Then you have watch people with a drawer full of pieces that most of the time, honestly, just sit there. And, nobody is telling themselves that a $5,000 watch tells time any better than a $50 Casio. To be fair, watch people are pretty upfront about that, but also they can spend a lot of money on watches. And then you have audio people running $500 cables between their pieces of equipment. You also see this with people who are into cameras. And, very often these aren't otherwise irrational people. They're just people who are very passionate about a specific thing. And yes, coffee has gotten here as well. I was at the World of Coffee Expo at San Diego a couple weeks ago. Video link will be up here as well as down in the description. And there were a few things at that event that struck me. It's this giant room with basically the entire spectrum of specialty coffee world inside. And on one side of the room, you have some of the most beautiful, expensive, pristine, and some people would probably say excessive espresso setups that you've ever laid eyes on and probably could never buy. And on the other side of the room, you have coffee producers, importers, and exporters who in many cases have gone to great expense to fly halfway around the world and go to this expo with the hopes of selling some of their coffee. And, there isn't people gathered around that group with smartphones trying to take pictures for Instagram, but those are the people who make the decisions that have more of an impact on what we experience in the cup than any piece of equipment that you can buy. So it creates this very interesting tension in the world of specialty coffee. And just to name it, I'm an enthusiast. I love coffee. I love coffee equipment. I have spent money on things that are basically impossible to justify based on the cup quality alone. And I totally get the pull with some of this stuff. And when you zoom out on this, every hobby that people get really into sort of follows a similar arc. And it starts pretty honestly, you get a little bit better of equipment and you get a better result with whatever it is that you're enjoying. Better gear produces better results, and the correlation between spending a little bit of extra money and having a better experience is pretty clear. A decent entry-level road or gravel bike is going to be measurably better than what you probably would buy at Walmart. And likewise, a $200 espresso grinder is going to have a huge impact when it comes to your espresso or filter coffee compared to a blade grinder. Then something shifts. At some point in every hobby, you hit this kind of difficult to qualify ceiling where the performance gains start to get more incremental, but the prices don't. And what's interesting is the community that is involved in that thing doesn't actually stop spending. It just changes what it's actually buying without ever actually naming that. Cycling is really interesting to look at as an example. And, I do like to bike, so I'll own that as well. But when you're talking about this, there are performance improvements there. You get lighter components, which have a correlation on how much effort you need to pedal the bike. Helps you go faster. But at a certain point, you're spending more on a crankset than most people would spend on a bike. And the actual reduction in weight or performance is low enough that you were probably better to just skip a burger or two the week before. Most cyclists know this. They buy the thing anyway because they like it, and that's okay. The world of watches has a pretty interesting take on this dynamic. People spend a lot of money when they get into watches, and what people are buying there isn't necessarily the ability to tell time. It's a story of craft, history, design, whatever you want to call it. And in that case, I think the transaction is also kind of at least clear. Audio world and camera world, though, it can get a little bit blurrier. Because on one hand, there is an argument that a certain type of cable can influence the quality of audio that is coming out of the speakers. However, to what degree and for what price is a little bit more ambiguous. So in cases like that, you start to see a little bit of a schism in the enthusiast community, one of which says spending this amount of money makes an absolute difference and you're crazy to say that it doesn't. And this other group of people that say that whole argument is hogwash and you should totally ignore it. And coffee actually sits somewhere sort of in between all those examples. Gear does make a better difference. Pressure stability makes a difference. Accurate readings and sensors make a difference. Good grinders make a difference. Also, though, people do push into the territory of diminishing returns. You do also have a group of people who buy things in coffee just because of the name history of that thing. And then you also have this entire segment of products and principles where people are spending a lot of money on them, but simultaneously arguing if they even make any difference at all when it comes to what you're getting in the cup. And that's without even touching the scope of different coffees that are available, which we will get to. So how do you sort out your response to all these dynamics when you're trying to figure out what kind of coffee setup you want to have, what kind of coffee you want to be brewing, and if you need to upgrade your equipment or not? I think when you look at the big picture, what has really happened in the coffee enthusiast community is we've taken a hobby, something that we enjoy, where spending extra at the entry level makes a huge difference. But we also have pushed that ceiling way beyond where it will make a difference for the majority of people and kind of sold the argument that the cups keep getting better and better and better. When the reality is, it gets different, but I don't think most people would say it actually gets better in a way that is proportional to the dollars spent. So I think it's important to actually zoom out and focus on the things that really matter in this conversation. But because I get asked about equipment way more than I get asked about anything else, there are a couple things that I think are good to think about that you are getting when you're actually buying something new. And one of those things is actually performance. If you want to pressure profile your espresso, or if you want a faster steaming experience, if you want a quick warm-up time, if you want complex automation. These are real features that you can shop for and buy. And, there are things that a $2,000 or $3,000 espresso machine can do that a $600 espresso machine just cannot do. And that can be a legitimate reason to say, I'm going to spend a little bit more on a specific thing. Not that you can't make a great cup of coffee with that $600 espresso machine, but it's going to give you a tighter lane within which you're able to do that. The second thing that people are often buying when they're shopping for something new, and very often this is implicit, is actually just a nicer object. Either the aesthetic that they're looking for, nicer materials, I think in some cases nicer manufacturing and supply chain, more polished software, or a better experience of using that thing, quieter in some cases. Even the weight of a portafilter or a specific piece of equipment can factor into this. And when you're buying that, you're really buying the experience of owning and using that thing, which is also an okay reason to spend a little bit more on something. In most cases, that doesn't actually make the coffee any better. The issue is that those two things often get sold as the same thing, a better cup of coffee. And even if that isn't spoken explicitly, that's what people on the outside looking in read into the whole conversation. And it just is not the reality. Things that will matter way more than a piece of equipment is fresh coffee and the actual quality of the coffee that you're buying. Good water. Water is something I talk about a lot on the channel, and having properly formulated water is something that can really jump the quality of your coffee. And a decent grinder. And beyond that, there really is a lot of money getting thrown around on things that, that look really cool and you think are going to make a big impact. And very often they just make your coffee preparation a little bit more complicated and in some cases even cumbersome. But people buy this stuff because they think it will make their coffee better. And, beyond the little stuff, even with espresso machines, that $5,000-$6,000 espresso machine may make your coffee a little bit better. It might just also steam a little bit faster and be a nicer object to own than the espresso machine that you currently have. And, I want to be careful here because at this point, it's kind of easy to just pile on and start lumping all the people who buy expensive equipment and the expensive equipment itself all into the same category of thing and say, it's just not valid, nobody should do that. And I don't think that's true either. Enthusiast spending elevates the industry overall. Flow profiling in mid-level espresso machines, for example. This is something that exists because somebody built it into a flagship machine first. Enthusiasts tried it, loved it, fell in love with this idea, and pushed for that technology to be implemented at lower price points. Entry-level grinders are another fantastic example of this. Compared to 10 years ago, the grinders on the entry level that are available today are just night and day better than what they used to be. And this is because partly the high end kept moving higher, and the benefits from that started to trickle down into grinders at lower price points. Passionate communities create demand for excellence across the whole supply chain, not just on the top end. Better green coffee, more transparency from roasters, more innovative processing methods, tighter tolerances on equipment manufacturing. A lot of this is driven by enthusiasts who spend a little bit disproportionately, and then the industry responds to that. And, I think spending on something that matters to you and you're passionate about, within your means, of course, I don't think anybody should overextend themselves on this stuff. But I think, if you really like a certain thing, spending a little bit more on it within your means is totally reasonable. The critique isn't actually the spending, it's the motivation behind the spending. And sometimes we can do this where we're even not being honest with ourselves about that motivation. Buying a nice espresso machine because you just want a nicer espresso machine is one thing. But convincing your significant other that you should spend $6,000 on an espresso machine because the coffee is going to be night and day better is not always true or a good motivation. So if you're trying to find your way through this and you're trying to figure out, do I upgrade my equipment? Where do I put my resources first? I really do want to give a framework that will help you sort that out. And it does start with great coffee. I hear stories all the time of people who buy nice equipment and then they're struggling to use it well, and they're buying pre-ground coffee at the grocery store. It's just not going to work. If you want to have an incredible coffee experience at home, you really do need to start with freshly roasted, freshly ground specialty coffee. Look for specialty coffee roasters in your city. Try one of their kind of house medium roasts if you're just getting into this, and experiment from there. This coffee is a pretty crazy coffee. It's a Ledi Bermudez roasted by September here in Canada. This is a very expensive and high-end cup of coffee, and those coffees can be really interesting and really fun to brew. But I also really think that buying everyday coffees at a lower price point is also good as long as they are sustainably sourced and grown. The whole truth behind that, though, is that any coffee that you get is going to have a bigger impact on your results in the cup than a piece of equipment. The grinder is the next thing. And when most people are going to do an upgrade on their coffee equipment, their go-to is the espresso machine or the brewer rather than the grinder. And I always tell people to invest in the grinder first and then figure out where they want to land on machines second. A good burr grinder will have a massive impact on the quality of your coffee to a point. Once you get above a certain price point, say $600 or something, which is a lot of money already to spend on a coffee grinder. Beyond that, things tend to get, I'll say, different rather than all around better. The coffee that you're using is going to have a way bigger impact anyways, but get a good grinder. Water is actually next. If you are on municipal tap water, and you're using that for your coffee, I would strongly suggest picking up a couple gallons of distilled water, getting a product like Third Wave water, there's other ones as well, and mixing up some water for your coffee. And if you want somebody to think you're really too crazy about your coffee hobby, just start talking about water, because I totally get that it just sounds nuts, but it makes a big difference. And it makes a little bit of sense when you think that, I don't really like the taste of my water, but I'm expecting to love the taste of my coffee. Coffee water, don't sleep on it. And then finally, it's technique, learning how to taste, and being consistent in how you're brewing. I've got a video on this for espresso, which I'll leave right here. I'm working on another one for pour over. I'll drop both of those in the description as well. Learning how to taste and dial in is actually a secret weapon when it comes to this stuff. Learning how to read different beans and make guesses on how to brew them. You don't need any fancy equipment to do any of that. It just is a matter of learning a couple principles, some time, some practice, and some application. And honestly, if you really want to get into this stuff, I know the pay to play thing is kind of fun and sexy, and it seems like this big adventure and flex. Oh, if I could only get that certain machine. But learning how to actually brew and taste is so much more of a tool in your tool belt than any of the equipment stuff. And after those things, a lot of the rest of it is just ritual. How do you want to feel using your equipment on a daily basis? Do you want the nice finish? If you do, that's okay. It might not give you a better cup of coffee, but it might be fun to use. Do you want a certain supply chain, or do you want the thing that you made to be manufactured to certain tolerances? You can get that. Do you want a certain aesthetic, certain premium materials? All these things are actually okay if you want them, and you're not going to put yourself in debt to get them. They're just not what moves the needle in the cup for most people most of the time. Back to that expo floor at the World of Coffee. I love looking at the crazy equipment just like anybody else. If somebody offered me a Slayer single group, I would find a way to make it work, of course. Who wouldn't? It's fun. It's excessive. Sure. But all of the people in that room, they weren't walking around with Slayer single groups in their hand. They were walking around with this. Different coffees grown by different people, brewed by other different people, enjoying the conversation that they were having. If you love the crazy equipment, love it. That's great. Just know what you're buying when you buy it. And if you want a better cup, start with what's in here. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic. We'll see you on the next one.